Hello guys, welcome to episode 2 of Rebel History. Today we are going to look into a topic which is a bit well known, but it is always treated as some kind of a gimmick. I have seen people be aware of this, but often people don't take it very seriously, or they have a very visceral and emotional response to it without even looking into the material. But today we will make a brief start with it. We will look into the thesis called the Phantom Time Hypothesis. This is a thesis first proposed by Heribert Ilig in the early 90s, where he proposed that the 3 centuries between 615 AD and 915 AD never existed. So these are considered the 300 phantom years, or 300 missing years. We will focus on a very small snippet of this theme and look into the start of the Dark Ages, and I will refer to a book called A Guide to the Phantom Dark Age, written by Emmett Scott. This is a book which looks into the work of Heribert Ilig. Now, for some reason, not much information is to be found on Ilig, but his work seems to be discredited on the internet by many people, so he seems to be attacked a lot. I have mostly read generalities like, "We have the astronomical data," or "Everything serious I have read says it is rubbish," and vague references are made to historical documents of Africa and America from the 10th century to disprove his thesis. Unfortunately, no examples are given. This seems to be the level of the discourse. Since I am not that serious and I simply am a very curious author, this is something I can look into. The reason why I think this topic is important is because this era deals with the time period which is considered the end of classical antiquity and the beginning of the Dark Ages, or medieval era. The term Dark Ages seems to have been first introduced by the Italian scholar Francesco Petrarch, who I consider a keystone figure. The term was originally not pejorative, but reflected merely the fact that little was known of European history between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the 11th century onwards. Later on, it became a more pejorative term, qualifying the so-called ignorance of the Church and the pre-Renaissance era. Nowadays, historians often don't like to call it the Dark Ages anymore, but the Dark Age as a concept was further defined in the 18th century by Edward Gibbon in his book The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which he began publishing in 1776, a very interesting year in which many things happened. Gibbon defined the Dark Ages to have started at the beginning of the 7th century. This is precisely with the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius and the definitive end of the classical Greco-Roman civilization. From this time onwards, the Germanic rulers of the West ceased to regard themselves as functionaries of the emperor in Constantinople. This is exactly the era which Heribert Ilig has looked into. Emmett Scott makes the point that the distortion of history was inextricably linked with the great split between the Western Germanic kingdoms and the Byzantine Empire, which occurred in the later years of the reign of Heraclius. Keep in mind that it was Heraclius who in 620 AD changed the official language in the Byzantine Empire from Latin to Greek. Allegedly. With the advent of the Reformation in the 16th century, the term Dark Age began to take a distinctively negative connotation. Protestant writers from the 17th century onwards would increasingly view everything between Constantine and the Reformation as a long and tedious age of barbarism and ignorance, and the same process was to continue during and after the Enlightenment, when men such as Voltaire and Immanuel Kant saw the whole of what we now call Middle Ages as a period of faith and thus the opposite of enlightenment. By the 19th century, this narrative of Dark Ages started to shift. As it was discovered, Roman civilization did not come to an end in 476 AD, not even in the West. The barbarian princes who had taken control of the western provinces in the 5th century were not mindless destroyers as was once believed. On the contrary, they adopted Roman civilization as quickly as they could and did everything in their power to uphold Roman institutions and customs. The medieval period was also not nearly as technologically or scientifically backwards as was once presumed. Figures such as Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus made advances in mathematics, experimented with light and the nature and properties of chemicals, and even theorized on the size of the solar system. Allegedly. Because it seems the earliest manuscript of the Animalbus written by Albertus Magnus was dated in the 16th century, with a little note stating it was written 300 years prior. What I also found relevant is that Albertus Magnus was beatified in 1622, almost 350 years after his death, the exact era in which Dionysius Petavius, the Jesuit, was active as scholarly chronology was formulated. If one studies and pays attention to history, what one often sees are events, characters, and distorted echoes, often reoccurring. Now, of course, if we use conventional wisdom, we can use the common phrase, history repeats itself, and explain it as a phenomenon called historic recurrence. Or we can explain it as somebody used copy-paste. Heribert Ilig's work focuses on these seemingly copy-paste events, characters, and distorted echoes from the 7th to the 10th century. Often, they seem to be exact duplicates with minor name changes. A few examples of these possible duplicates or distorted echoes in the 300 Phantom Years are the following. 1. The Avars and the Magyars. The Ural-Altic speaking Avars, or Pannonian Avars as they were qualified as, who take possession of the Hungarian plains in the 6th century seem very similar to the Ural-Altic speaking Magyars who take possession of the Hungarian plains in the 9th century, exactly 3 centuries later. Gyolo Laszlo, with his double conquest of the Carpathian Basin theory, even states that the Avar culture is very similar, sometimes even identical to Hungarian culture. Now both these factions seem to look very much like another faction, which some of you may know. The Avars are even linked with the so-called Griffin and Tendril culture. Probably just a coincidence. 2. The Lombards. The Lombards whom we find in possession of Italy in the early 7th century seem very much like the Lombards whom we find in possession of southern Italy at the start of the 10th century, exactly 3 centuries later. 3. The Merovingians and Carolingians. The Frankish Merovingians of the 6th century and early 7th century seem to reappear in the 9th and 10th century as the Frankish Carolingians. We will go more extensively into this in another episode. 4. The Muslim conquest of northern India. The Muslim conquest of northern India by Muhammad bin Qasim of the Umayyad Caliphate around 710 sounds very much like the Muslim conquest of northern India by Mahmud of Ghazni around 1010. Again, 300 years later. Keep in mind that Mahmud is the same name as Mohammed. 5. The Christian Reconquista. The most interesting of these is the Christian Reconquista in Spain, which was a period which lasted from 712 AD until 1492, a very interesting year in which many things happened. The start of the Reconquista seems to have commenced with the victory of Pelagius the Visigoth, also called Don Pelayo, against the invading Moors of the Umayyad Caliphate in 722, after which the Kingdom of Asturias was formed. This kingdom remained relatively static for 300 years. What a coincidence. After these 300 years, it became the Kingdom of Leon and expanded into the Moorish territories. It seems the territory gains of the victory of Pelagius the Visigoth were delayed for 3 centuries until the early 11th century. This entire period of the Reconquista describes a series of military skirmishes over 8 centuries which seem to parallel each other. The concept of the Reconquista is currently disputed by various conventional historians. What is often seen in this early Dark Age period, and not just with the Reconquista, is as if history terminates in the early 7th century and then recommences without any appreciable disruption 3 centuries later, and there just appears a gap or a paucity in written sources and developments for 300 years. This period is also considered the age during which the Vikings seem to have rampaged around the continent, burning, looting, and killing, and thus limited written sources of this era have remained. Emmett Scott and Heribert Ilig make a very interesting reference to the archaeologist, and I am probably mispronouncing her name, Margaret Hermans Audadottir, and refer that the early Viking homesteads share many features with those of the Merovingian age of the 7th century. We will get back to this later on. Caesar Baronius qualified the era from the fall of the Carolingian Empire in 888 until the start of the Gregorian reforms in 1046 as Dark Ages, due to its lack of writers in these ages. But if we look at the period between the 6th and 9th century, the lack of writers and manuscripts was even far more significant. What we also see is that this period was considered the Byzantine Dark Ages due to a paucity of records. What a coincidence. Apparently, this paucity was caused by a widespread upheaval, but this does not make any sense, as even though Byzantium lost significant territory during this time, Constantinople was not sacked during this period, and there is no evidence for a destruction of records during these ages. Furthermore, there never was a book-burning inquisition like there was in the West, but we find precisely the same gap as in the West. And just like Western Europe, the records and chronicles which covered these periods were almost all written centuries later. This is the context with which Heribert Ilig began his research. If you want to know more about this specific topic, you can visit the Substack or read the books by either Heribert Ilig or Emmett Scott, or just stay tuned for the upcoming episodes where I will refer to other sources which reach similar conclusions and we will delve further into this topic. This was a very brief introduction to the 300 Phantom Years. Let me know if you had heard of the 300 Phantom Years as well, where you first heard of this and how this information was presented, and also what you felt or thought about it when you first heard of it. If this was an entirely new concept to you and you first learned about this after watching this video, let me know as well. I have not yet delved into all the arguments of Ilig today, as my intention was to first present the context of our existing narrative. Before we break the rules, we have to learn the rules. Next week we will look into Joseph Scaliger, who is considered the founder of modern chronology as a science, and that's a quote. This was episode 2. I hope you enjoyed it. We have 10 episodes remaining, and I thank you for your attention.